The year is 1903 CE, and the Roman system has completely collapsed. Following the assassination of Emperor Commodus, the elite Praetorian Guard murders his successor, and then literally auctions off the imperial throne to the highest bidder in a torchlit courtyard. The man who would end this circus held no traditional pedigree. Septimius Severus was born in North Africa, far from the established Roman aristocracy, but he possessed the ultimate bargaining chip: absolute command over the battle-hardened legions stationed along the Danube frontier. Disgusted by the brazen corruption in the capital, Severus mobilized his troops. He bypassed the Senate entirely, marching straight on Rome with a strict determination to impose order through overwhelming force. Knowing he couldn't fight on two fronts, Severus made a calculated political maneuver. He sent envoys to his main rival in Britain, Claudius Albinus, granting him the junior title of Caesar to temporarily pacify him and protect the rear of the advancing Danubian army. Severus recognized that the polite political negotiations of the past were dead. To rescue the empire from immediate ruin, he dropped the facade of diplomacy entirely and forged a state ruled openly by the sword. The moment Severus entered Rome, he summoned the treacherous Praetorian Guard. Instead of rewarding them, he stripped them of their ceremonial armor, banished them from the city, and filled their vacant ranks entirely with his own loyal, battle-tested frontier soldiers. With the capital secured, he turned his war machine outward to hunt down the remaining claimants to the throne. He marched east to crush Pessinnius Niger in Syria, and then pivoted west to finally deal with Claudius Albinus. The scale of this Roman-on-Roman violence was massive. The conflict climaxed in Gaul at the brutal Battle of Lugdunum, where Severus deployed roughly 75,000 men to slaughter Albinus's forces and cement his absolute control. Upon returning to Rome, Severus turned his attention to the politicians who had backed his rivals. He purged the Senate, executing nearly 30 of its members on charges of treason, to make it clear that military supremacy, not senatorial decree, was the sole basis of his rule. For 2 centuries, emperors had maintained the Principate, a pleasant political fiction that they shared power equally with the Senate. Severus killed that illusion, openly embracing the reality of a harsh military dictatorship. With his internal rivals dead, Severus focused his new military state outward. As we see on this map of the empire, he launched 3 massive expansion campaigns, pushing the borders into Parthia in the east, deep into Africa in the south, and up to the northern edges of Britain. Following this advance into the east, his legions pushed across the Euphrates River into Parthian territory. They sacked the royal capital of Ctesiphon, seized its immense wealth, and permanently annexed northern Mesopotamia into the Roman fold. In the south, he secured the Sahara frontier against desert nomads, bringing lucrative new trade routes into the empire. He funneled much of that wealth directly into his hometown of Leptis Magna, transforming the provincial port with sweeping new forums and lavish marble monuments. His final campaign took him to the freezing, unforgiving highlands of Caledonia, modern-day Scotland. Despite being severely ill, Severus led 50,000 men in a grinding guerrilla war against local tribes, extensively rebuilding the stone defenses of Hadrian's Wall along the way. These relentless campaigns pushed the Roman Empire to its greatest geographical extent in history. However, permanently garrisoning these distant, hostile borders required an immense amount of manpower, stretching the imperial supply lines and treasury to their absolute limits. Back in the capital, the imperial court was undergoing its own transformation under Empress Julia Mamaea. A powerful Syrian noblewoman, she actively shaped state policy and surrounded herself with an inner circle of philosophers, physicians, and rhetoricians that brought a cultural renaissance to Rome. But that high-minded intellectual culture stood in stark contrast to the reality of her 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. The designated heirs to the empire harbored a deep, violent hatred for one another, constantly plotting and squabbling within the palace walls. Desperate to forge some kind of unity between them, Severus dragged both sons away from the comforts of Rome. He brought them to the freezing front lines of the British campaign, hoping the harsh realities of military administration would force them to cooperate. It didn't work. The man who could violently enforce order across the entire known world, from the deserts of Syria to the bogs of Scotland, was completely powerless to stop his own family from tearing itself apart. By 211 CE, the grueling conditions of the British campaign finally caught up with the aging emperor, breaking his iron constitution. Severus lay dying in a freezing military camp at Eboracum, the site of modern-day York. As his health failed, he summoned his 2 feuding sons to his bedside and delivered his final cynical philosophy of rule: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and scorn all others. That advice failed almost immediately. Less than a year after taking power, the harmony Severus demanded dissolved completely when Caracalla had his brother Geta assassinated, murdering him while he clung to their mother's arms. The rest of the deathbed maxim laid bare the fatal flaw of the Severan system. By stripping away civic authority and relying exclusively on the loyalty of the army, Severus rendered every other Roman institution meaningless. The directive to enrich the soldiers carried a staggering economic cost. Severus had already expanded the size of the army and drastically increased their annual pay, creating a military budget that the traditional tax base simply could not support. To finance this massive expenditure, he resorted to a dangerous fiscal trick behind the locked doors of the Imperial Mint. He drastically debased the currency, reducing the physical purity of the standard Roman denarius. This chart visualizes the immediate fallout. As the silver content of the Roman coin plummets on this descending line, we see a violently spiking secondary line representing rampant inflation, which quickly wiped out the purchasing power of the average Roman citizen. The economic damage was paired with an even deadlier political precedent. Because Severus proved that the throne belonged to whoever paid the army best, this rising bar graph shows how future emperors became trapped, forced to constantly buy the loyalty of mutinous legions just to survive. Severus succeeded in his primary goal. He saved Rome from the immediate chaos of 193 CE by cutting away the illusion of civilian rule. But in building a state entirely dependent on military bribery and devalued coin, he planted the exact economic and political seeds that would tear the empire apart in the crisis of the 3rd century. This is the Arch of Septimius Severus, standing prominently in the Roman Forum since 203 AD. It was built to celebrate the military victories of a single family, but if you look closely at the inscription up top, you'll find the physical evidence of a state-mandated disappearance. On the 4th line of text, the marble has been carved back so deep it sinks into the stone. These jagged marks were left when the original bronze letters were ripped out, only to be replaced by new titles for the surviving emperor, Caracalla. The name originally fixed to this stone was Geta, Caracalla's younger brother. After his death in 211 AD, the Senate was coerced into issuing a Damnatio Memoriae. It was an official condemnation that legally mandated the destruction of a person's entire public existence, from the faces on their coins to the names on their monuments. Caracalla's administration moved to eliminate every living trace of his brother's influence. The state tracked down and executed an estimated 20,000 people, anyone from Geta's personal guard to the intellectuals and servants who had worked in his household. Wiping out 20,000 citizens and defacing the capital's largest monuments creates a visible, echoing void. This scale of destruction serves as a permanent record of the purge itself, a level of violence that suggests Geta's memory alone was viewed as a threat to the stability of the new regime. This survives as a portrait of Caracalla. The short military beard and the famously aggressive scowl were highly deliberate, designed to project the image of a soldier emperor who ruled through strength. Geta was described in stark contrast. Contemporary accounts detail a melodic voice, a slight stammer, and a personality that was studious rather than militaristic. He surrounded himself with the writers and intellectuals of his mother's court, though he was also noted for a strange obsession with extravagant, themed banquets. This internal rivalry was managed geographically during the British campaign of 208 AD. Their father, Septimius Severus, moved the imperial court to Eboracum, modern-day York, to stabilize the northern frontier marked by Hadrian's Wall. While Severus and Caracalla commanded the legions in the Caledonian Wars to the north, Geta was entrusted with the civil administration of the province. From the capital at York, he managed the logistics, judicial systems, and the complex bureaucracy of the Roman state. Geta proved remarkably effective in this administrative role. His competence in the rear, combined with a striking physical resemblance to his father, began to transform him into a legitimate political alternative to his brother's erratic behavior. When Emperor Severus died in York in early 211, the brothers inherited the throne as co-emperors. During the journey back to Rome, they refused to share meals or lodgings, living in constant fear that the other would use the journey to administer poison. Once in the capital, they physically bisected the imperial palace on the Palatine hill. They built barricades to block the corridors, ensuring the servants of one emperor could never interact with the other, effectively splitting the Roman government in two. The stalemate became so severe that they drafted a plan to cleave the Roman Empire into two separate states. Caracalla would rule the west from Rome, while Geta would move his capital to the east, establishing a new Senate in Antioch or Alexandria. Their mother, Julia Mamaea, used her significant political authority to veto the plan. She argued that while they could divide the land and the sea, they could not divide their mother, and she feared a geographic split would lead inevitably to a catastrophic civil war. Without a partition, the joint rule remained paralyzed. The only barrier to open conflict was a mother's influence over two sons who were already actively attempting to kill one another. In late December 211, Caracalla feigned a desire for reconciliation. He asked Julia Mamaea to arrange a private meeting in her apartments, where both brothers could meet unarmed and without their bodyguards. Geta arrived alone, trusting in the sanctuary of his mother's presence to protect him. As they met, a group of centurions loyal to Caracalla burst into the room. Geta fled to his mother, clinging to her neck for safety as the soldiers closed in. Geta was struck down and killed while still in his mother's arms. The attack was so violent that Julia Mamaea was wounded in the struggle, her clothes completely soaked in her youngest son's blood. In the aftermath, Caracalla forbade his mother from mourning. To ensure her own survival, she was forced to celebrate the murder of her son as if it were a stroke of political good fortune. The purge reached private monuments like the Arch of the Argentari. Look at the empty space next to the surviving figures. Geta's entire figure was chiseled away with such force it left behind only a rough, unfinished texture. Caracalla succeeded in removing his brother from the records, but he created a new kind of monument in the process. The gouges in the marble and the sanded-off faces on coins survived as permanent, tactile evidence of the very man he tried to make the world forget. Look closely at this marble portrait bust of the Roman Emperor Caracalla. Notice the severe military crop, the thick neck, and that deep-set pugnacious scowl. Every detail of his appearance, right down to the rough Gallic tunic he made fashionable, was highly curated to project sheer, intimidating physical power. Compare Caracalla's aggressive posturing to this marble bust of Alexander the Great. Caracalla was manically obsessed with the legendary conqueror. He wore blonde wigs to mimic him and even revived obsolete Macedonian phalanxes in his army, desperately trying to force a comparison. Beneath that tough guy facade was a deeply insecure air. When his father secured him a political marriage as a teenager, Caracalla despised his new bride. He began his rule by having his father-in-law executed on fabricated evidence, eventually exiling and killing his wife as well. His ambition extended to his own bloodline. When his father, Emperor Septimius Severus, fell severely ill during a military campaign in Britain, historical rumors swirled that Caracalla actively tried to persuade the doctors to speed up the old man's death. Caracalla's entire rule was a constant, violent performance. The scowls, the executions, and the military cosplay were the armor of a man who equated absolute control with his own survival. In February 211 AD, Emperor Severus finally died in his bed in York. With his last breaths, he gave his two sons and co-heirs a cynical piece of advice: agree with each other, make the soldiers rich, and ignore everyone else. Caracalla immediately violated the first instruction. He harbored an intense, lifelong hatred for his younger brother and co-emperor, Geta. You can see the scale of this paranoia in these ruins of the Palatine Hill in Rome. When the brothers returned from Britain, they divided the massive imperial palace right down the middle. They blocked the connecting corridors, built separate entrances, and surrounded themselves with heavily armed guards, turning a family home into a fortified domestic battlefield. A sustainable co-rule requires the ability to share. For an emperor whose ego demanded solitary glory, there was no room for a partner. By December 211, Caracalla decided to act. He asked their mother, Julia Mamaea, to arrange a private reconciliation meeting in her personal apartments, knowing Geta would arrive unarmed and without his bodyguard. It was a trap. The moment Geta entered, centurions loyal to Caracalla rushed into the room. Geta fled to his mother, but the soldiers struck him down right in her arms. Covered in her younger son's blood, Julia Mamaea was strictly forbidden by Caracalla from shedding a single tear. To legitimize his absolute control, Caracalla wielded the law to wipe out his brother's existence. Look at the Arch of Septimius Severus in the Roman Forum. Caracalla subjected Geta to Damnatio Memoriae. This was the systematic removal of a person's name and image from all state records. If you focus on the fourth line of the Latin inscription here, you can see the violent physical evidence of this policy. The stone is aggressively gouged and chiseled away right where Geta's name and honorific titles used to sit. Caracalla took the erasure far beyond stone monuments. He launched a lethal purge across Rome, executing an estimated 20,000 of Geta's political supporters, associates, and even the staff who favored him. The slaughter in the palace and the subsequent purge signaled a shift. The Roman state was becoming an autocracy, where the only path to stability was through the elimination of all rivals. Having alienated the Senate and horrified the public, Caracalla's survival relied entirely on his father's second piece of advice, bribing the military. He instantly raised the average legionary's pay by 50%. To fund this massive military payroll, he created this specific silver coin, the Antoninianus. While it was officially valued at 2 denarii, the government debased the metal, putting only 1.5 denarii worth of actual silver inside it. In 1212, Caracalla expanded Roman citizenship to nearly every free person in the empire. While this appears to be an act of inclusion, the move instantly turned millions of provincial subjects into taxpayers, forcing them to bankroll his military expenditures. The wealth he didn't spend on the army went into architectural vanity projects designed to enforce his grandeur. You can see the results in these towering, massive brick and concrete ruins, the famous Baths of Caracalla. By prioritizing military loyalty above all else, Caracalla turned the Roman government into a transactional system, a military protection racket funded by the rest of the empire. His violence soon bled across the borders. When Caracalla visited Alexandria, he discovered the citizens were openly mocking his claim that he murdered Geta in self-defense. In a rage, he ordered his troops to massacre a substantial portion of the city's population. By 216 AD, he marched east, determined to cement his Alexander the Great legacy. To gain territory without a real fight, he proposed a fake marriage pact to the king of the Parthian Empire. The Parthian king accepted the truce. Caracalla invited the king and his royal court to a celebratory feast. But as the guests relaxed, Caracalla ordered his troops to draw their weapons and slaughter the unarmed Parthians right at the dinner tables. The conqueror's persona had reached its limit. To maintain his authority, Caracalla now relied entirely on the tactics of the trap and the ambush. Caracalla's relentless need to perform as an untouchable tough guy proved to be a fatal flaw. He mercilessly mocked and alienated his staff, taking special pleasure in bullying his Praetorian prefect, Macrinus. Macrinus realized he was dealing with an erratic killer and correctly guessed he would be next on the purge list. To survive, he decided to orchestrate an assassination before the emperor could strike. The death of Caracalla is a final historical irony. In the spring of 217 AD, the self-proclaimed reincarnated Alexander the Great was marching his army near Carrhae. He halted and stepped off the road to urinate, leaving himself completely isolated and vulnerable. As he relieved himself, a soldier named Justin Martialis slipped up behind him and delivered a fatal strike with a sword. The 29-year-old tyrant died in the dirt in the most unglamorous, pathetic manner possible. Caracalla's manufactured myth collapsed in a roadside ditch. Rome under Emperor Caracalla ran on a simple, brutal logic. The imperial treasury existed to purchase the loyalty of violent men. Caracalla was a militaristic tyrant who openly despised the Senate, opting instead to enrich his legions at all costs. His second-in-command was Marcus Opellius Macrinus, an equestrian lawyer and pragmatic administrator who lacked any traditional noble blood. Caracalla frequently mocked his prefect as effeminate and martially weak, sneering at a lawyer who preferred refined administration to the grit of the camp. Despite these insults, Macrinus's bureaucratic utility made him indispensable. In this era, administrative competence was beginning to rival ancestral pedigree. In the spring of 217 CE, Macrinus intercepted a prophecy predicting his own rise to power. Under the paranoid Caracalla, this was a death warrant. Realizing he had to strike first to survive, Macrinus arranged an ambush during a roadside stop near Haran on April 8th. He recruited a disgruntled soldier named Julius Martialis to eliminate the emperor while the royal guard's back was turned. To deflect suspicion, Macrinus rushed to the body of the man he had just ordered killed, feigning intense, agonizing grief. Driven by the immediate need to survive, the bureaucrat took the throne, becoming the first emperor in history who was not a member of the Senate. Macrinus spent his entire reign in the East. He based himself in Antioch, never visiting Rome to secure his legitimacy with the traditional elite. He immediately inherited a catastrophic geopolitical crisis, a brutal, expensive war with the Parthian Empire that Caracalla had failed to finish. Applying a lawyer's logic to a soldier's war, Macrinus simply bought peace, paying the Parthians 200 million sesterces to end the fighting. Domestically, the treasury was bankrupt. Caracalla's massive military pay raises had left the empire's finances in total disarray. Macrinus's administrative logic was outmatched by the power of bribery and dynastic myth. In the 3rd century, Rome was now a mercenary state. The final clash arrived on June 8, 218 CE. Macrinus led his highly trained Praetorian guards against the rebel legions outside Antioch. Initially, Macrinus's forces dominated. His disciplined loyalists shed their heavy armor for lighter shields, easily breaking the rebel lines. The tide turned when Julia Mamaea and her daughter personally leapt from their chariots into the chaos to rally their retreating men. Seeing the counterattack, Macrinus's nerve broke. He abandoned his loyal troops and fled the field alone. The lack of martial grit that Caracalla had once mocked him for, the preference for flight over a soldier's death, ultimately cost him the empire. Macrinus shaved his head and tried to reach Rome disguised as a common courier, but he was recognized and captured in Chalcedon. He was executed in Cappadocia, alongside his 10-year-old son and co-emperor Diadumenian, ending their brief attempt at a new dynasty. Their severed heads were sent as trophies to the 14-year-old Elagabalus, who entered Antioch as the new ruler of the Roman world. In Rome, the Senate issued a decree of Damnatio Memoriae. Macrinus's name was hacked from every official record, and his marble portraits were mutilated. The Senate's authority had effectively vanished. The legions had seen that they, and not the aristocrats in Rome, were now the true kingmakers. Macrinus proved that a competent outsider could seize the throne, but his demise proved that an emperor who prioritizes budgets over soldiers will never survive the Roman war machine. In the spring of 217 AD, the erratic emperor Caracalla stepped off a road near Carrhae to relieve himself and was stabbed to death by one of his own soldiers. Within 3 days, the Roman Empire found itself with a massive power vacuum. The man who stepped into that void was Macrinus, Caracalla's own Praetorian prefect. He broke a centuries-old tradition. Macrinus was an equestrian bureaucrat of Berber descent, marking the first time a man outside the senatorial class took the throne. He faced an immediate structural problem. The Roman military operated on loyalty to the Severan bloodline, a royal pedigree that Macrinus completely lacked. Without the natural devotion of the legions, a paper title offered no protection. To survive the inevitable military backlash, Macrinus had to construct an artificial dynasty from scratch. His immediate solution centered on his 9-year-old son Diadumenian. While traveling through the frontier city of Zeugma, Macrinus officially elevated the boy to the rank of Caesar, presenting him as the guaranteed heir. Next came the legal branding. Macrinus added the name Antoninus to his son's official title, deliberately hijacking the legacy of Rome's 2nd century Golden Age to buy goodwill from the troops. The regime then planted supernatural origin stories to simulate divine favor. They circulated rumors that the boy was born with a caul, a piece of amniotic membrane shaped exactly like a royal diadem, and that an eagle had peacefully landed on his cradle. This silver coin features the profile portrait of Diadumenian, demonstrating how the regime flooded the empire with the boy's image to project immediate stability. This marble bust reveals deliberate physical distortion in official art. Notice the slight mustache and heavy brow, both contradicting his actual age of 9. Through names, myths, and modified statues, Diadumenian ceased to be a child. He functioned entirely as a manufactured political brand designed to pacify a volatile military. That military pacification was quickly tested. From exile in the city of Emesa, Julia Mamaea, the aunt of the murdered Caracalla, began mobilizing the surviving members of the true Severn Dynasty. This map visualizes her strategy, leveraging massive family wealth to push bribes from Emesa to surrounding legionary camps, buying support for Elagabalus. Meanwhile, Macrinus cut legionary pay. As the map shifts, those disgruntled camps turn hostile, converging against Antioch. The financial and military failures reached their breaking point. The Syrian legions officially broke their oaths and entered open revolt against the Equestrian emperor. A bureaucratic dynasty built on technicalities and sculpted propaganda fractures instantly when confronted by the hard currency and entrenched loyalty of a true royal bloodline. Back in Antioch in May of 218 AD, Macrinus enacted a desperate countermeasure. He officially elevated Diadumenian from Caesar to full Augustus, making the boy his co-emperor. The promotion had a highly specific administrative motive. Elevating the boy provided the legal pretext needed to authorize massive emergency cash bonuses in a final attempt to buy back the troops' loyalty. The conflict climaxed at the Battle of Antioch, but as the lines clashed, Macrinus made a catastrophic decision. He lost his nerve, shed his imperial purple, and fled the battlefield in disguise. The moment the emperor abandoned his men, his carefully crafted illusion of imperial strength vanished. With his father gone and the army routed, the 10-year-old Diadumenian began a doomed flight toward the Parthian border, hoping to find sanctuary. He did not make it. He was captured at Zeugma, the exact city where his imperial dream was manufactured just 1 year prior. The boy was executed. His severed head was delivered to the teenager Elagabalus as a victory trophy. Back in the capital, the Roman Senate issued a final act of retaliation. They passed a decree of Damnatio Memoriae, a formal condemnation of memory, ordering the complete historical erasure of both Macrinus and Diadumenian. This engraved Latin text on a flat stone slab represents the type of permanent historical record targeted for physical erasure. Across the empire, workers took chisels to public monuments to violently gouge out the boy's name. Propaganda, legal titles, and carefully carved statues can build an emperor in the minds of the people, but it only takes one lost battle and a sharp chisel to erase him entirely. Look at this painting. We are in Rome. The year is 220 AD, and the ceiling of a lavish dining room has just opened up to drop a deluge of pink petals onto the empire's elite. But the petals kept falling. What started as an extravagant party trick turned into an execution. The floral avalanche was so heavy that several guests could not crawl out, and they slowly suffocated to death beneath the fragrant weight. The host of this deadly banquet was Elagabalus, Rome's teenage emperor. Ancient records tell us this young ruler served their guests camel feet, let tame lions loose in the dining halls, and rode backward through the streets in chariots. There is a massive catch to all of these wild stories. Every single surviving text describing these atrocities was written by older, deeply conservative politicians who personally despised the young emperor. We have to peel back the layers of this political propaganda. Once we look past the sensational rumors of the victors, we can start to figure out if the ruler dubbed Rome's worst emperor was actually the target of a calculated smear campaign. The true story begins in 218 AD, in the military camps of Syria. A powerful Roman matriarch named Julia Mamaea had been exiled, and she used her immense family wealth to buy the loyalty of the Eastern legions and reclaim control of the empire. Mamaea needed a figurehead. She brought forward her 14-year-old grandson, a high priest from Mamaea, and spread a highly convenient rumor that the boy was the illegitimate son of a beloved former emperor. The army bought the lie and marched on Rome. This ancient coin shows exactly what arrived in the capital. The teenager brought a massive, uncarved black meteorite. It was called a beetle, and it housed the physical presence of the Syrian sun god Elagabalus. For centuries, Rome's religion operated under a strict hierarchy led by Jupiter. Elagabalus crushed that order, making a black rock a supreme deity. To consolidate power, Rome's oldest artifacts, the Fire of Vesta and Sali shields, were locked inside the new god's temple. The Roman Senate, a body of wealthy men accustomed to ruling the world, suddenly found themselves forced to bow to a foreign rock. The emperor had publicly humiliated the most powerful men in the city. To understand why the establishment hated Elagabalus so deeply, we have to look at the Roman concept of virtus. This was a rigid, hyper-masculine code built on military strength, self-control, and stoicism. It was the only acceptable way for an emperor to behave. Elagabalus rejected this code completely. The young ruler refused the traditional wool toga, choosing instead vibrant Syrian silks. They wore heavy makeup, painted their eyes, and removed all body hair. This subversion carried over into the emperor's private life. Elagabalus took a former slave and charioteer named Heracles as a husband. When interacting with the court, the teenager demanded to be addressed not with standard imperial titles, but as a lady or a queen. According to the historian Cassius Dio, the emperor went even further. Elagabalus supposedly promised a vast fortune to any physician who could surgically construct a vagina in their body. The final religious boundary fell when Elagabalus married a Vestal virgin. By Roman law, these priestesses were sworn to strict celibacy, and the standard punishment for breaking that vow was to be buried alive. The Roman elite watched a teenager dismantle their religious hierarchy while openly rejecting their definitions of gender and class. To the old guard, this behavior was a fatal infection, threatening the patriarchal core of the state itself. Julia Mamaea, the grandmother who orchestrated the original coup, realized her puppet had become a liability. To save her family's grip on power, she quietly shifted her political backing and military bribes towards Elagabalus's younger, much more compliant cousin. In the spring of 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard mutinied. They cornered the 18-year-old emperor and their mother in a latrine, where both were brutally slaughtered by the soldiers sworn to protect them. The state ordered a Damnatio Memoriae, the total erasure of the emperor's existence. The mutilated bodies of Elagabalus and Julia Mamaea were dragged through the streets of Rome and dumped into the Tiber River. Murdering a sitting emperor requires serious justification. Writers connected to the political establishment, like Cassius Dio and Herodian, were tasked with explaining to the Roman public why the brutal assassination was necessary for the empire's survival. These historians took the teenager's actual gender nonconformity and weaponized it. They framed the emperor's identity as a grotesque madness, inflating cultural differences into absurd myths about smothering guests with rose petals to legitimize the two. The story of Elagabalus forces us to look carefully at who writes our histories. When all the surviving records are penned by the exact same political faction that ordered the execution, we have to ask how many other complex, marginalized identities have been permanently painted as monsters by the very people who murdered them. By the year 222 AD, the military camps of Rome were boiling with rage. Their emperor, the teenage priest Elagabalus, was running a decadent, volatile court that openly mocked Roman discipline. A mutiny was imminent. The only person who saw the coming collapse was the true power behind the throne, the Severan matriarch, Julia Mamaea. She realized her grandson's erratic behavior was going to get their entire family slaughtered. To save the dynasty, Mamaea executed a desperate political maneuver. She forced Elagabalus to formally adopt his own 13-year-old cousin, Alexander, legally installing the boy as the new heir to the empire. Elagabalus quickly understood that this quiet, popular boy was a direct threat to his life. He attempted to have Alexander murdered, but the plot unraveled, triggering exactly what Mamaea had feared, a violent uprising from the Praetorian Guard. The Guard stormed the imperial quarters, hacking Elagabalus and his mother to death. To show their absolute contempt, the soldiers dragged the bodies through the streets and threw them into the Tiber River. In the bloody aftermath, a 13-year-old boy was crowned master of the Roman world. This transition proved an ominous reality. The Senate no longer chose who ruled Rome. The army did. Surprisingly, the young Severus Alexander actually tried to be a good emperor. He immediately handed legislative authority back to the Senate, creating a 16-man advisory council to govern through civic law rather than imperial whim. He also introduced a policy of profound religious tolerance. In his private chapel, he prayed every morning before a collection of statues that placed Abraham, Jesus, and Orpheus side by side. Alexander poured the state's resources into massive urban renewal. He meticulously restored Rome's decaying historical monuments, including the Colosseum. His administration financed vast infrastructure projects, funding major renovations to public spaces like the Baths of Caracalla, and completing the Aqua Alexandrina, the last of the great aqueducts of ancient Rome. These civilian triumphs created the illusion of a returning golden age, but it was a fragile facade. Alexander was prioritizing civic virtues and public works in an empire that was becoming aggressively militarized. Furthermore, the emperor wasn't actually making the decisions. Absolute control rested with his mother, Julia Mamaea. Her suffocating grip on the administration stripped Alexander of any independent authority. Her jealousy dictated state policy. When Alexander married, Mamaea felt threatened by the new empress. She forced her son to exile his teenage wife and execute his father-in-law. The emperor complied, openly weeping as the orders were carried out. To keep the military in check, Mamaea relied on Domitius Ulpianus. He was a brilliant jurist and the Praetorian prefect, tasked with forcing the rowdy legions to submit to strict civilian law. The Praetorian Guard violently rejected Ulpian's discipline. The tension exploded into a massive 3-day urban battle in the streets of Rome, pitting the heavily armed guards against the city's own citizens. The riot reached a horrific climax when mutinous soldiers smashed their way into the imperial palace. They cornered Ulpian and murdered him right at the feet of the terrified emperor. The entire Roman army now saw exactly what they were dealing with. Their good emperor was a powerless puppet, incapable of protecting his own chief minister, let alone defending the borders of the empire. And those borders were about to fracture. In the east, a massive and highly organized new threat suddenly emerged: the Sassanid Persian Empire. Alexander marched his legions out to meet them, but his mother's over-caution infected the command tent. The young emperor hesitated, paralyzing the Roman counteroffensive. Because Alexander failed to advance and support his flanks, a massive Roman column was completely surrounded and slaughtered by Persian forces. Alexander survived the conflict and returned to Rome, but the Eastern campaign was a political disaster. The battle-hardened legions stripped away whatever thin respect they still held for their commander-in-chief. The final crisis came shortly after, when Germanic tribes breached the Rhine frontier. Alexander and his deeply demoralized army were forced into a grueling march north to repel the invasion. But instead of ordering his men into combat, Alexander and his mother tried to buy their way out of the war, offering heavy bribes to the Germanic tribes in exchange for peace. For the Roman legions, this was the ultimate cowardice. Disgusted by an emperor who would rather pay barbarians than fight them, the troops entirely abandoned their allegiance. They needed a leader who understood violence, and they found one in Maximinus Thrax. He was a hulking, lower-class soldier who represented the exact opposite of Alexander's refined, peaceful civic virtue. Mutinous soldiers stormed the imperial camp at Mainz. They found the 26-year-old emperor hiding in his tent, weeping and blaming his mother for the disaster, before the troops hacked them both to death. The assassination of Severus Alexander ended his dynasty, but it also killed the Roman ideal of civilian rule. By crowning a brutal soldier like Maximinus Thrax, the army plunged Rome into 50 years of civil war and foreign invasion, proving that in a world governed by swords, civic virtue without military strength is a fatal combination.